In this video, we're going to look at how we can tweak the activity lifecycle. So I want to show you guys a couple of examples of very common scenarios that you're going to run across with a lot of different kinds of apps you might want to create. I'm not going to cover every single scenario that you can modify this activity lifecycle with because that would take, well, forever, and all that stuff is really well laid out in the documentation. At the very least, though, I want to show you guys a couple really common scenarios and show you guys how to interact with the activity lifecycle, at least how to modify it, so that if you run into a problem, you will know where to look if it is a problem with the activity lifecycle, something you might want to modify, and then you would just go and check out the documentation. Anyway, the couple of examples that I have here for this video are a login screen and a main page screen, like a root page screen. So we're going to look at both of those instances. So the first one I want to work on is the login screen. And here's the behavior that I want with this. If you're not logged in, no matter what activity was launched, I want it to go to the login screen. In fact, I'm not even going to change the default activity here. Remember how the main activity has the intent filter of main and launcher? I'm going to still have it launch the main activity when we open up the app, but if we're not logged in, I want to make sure that the login activity is presented. Then, once the login activity is done and finishes and logs the person in, I want it to go to the main screen. So basically, if you're not logged in, you launch the application with any activity, we want to take a look at the login screen. The login screen will present a username and password box. Once they hit enter, we want the login screen to direct them to the main activity, the root activity, after they're successfully logged in. So in order to do this example, the first thing we need to do is create a login activity. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to right click, select new, come down here to activity and say blank activity. And then I'm going to call this a login activity. After that, I'm going to go ahead and hit finish. And that'll go ahead and create our layout file and our login activity Java file. Now for the layout file, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into text, and let's go ahead and just make this really simple. Inside this relative layout, I'm going to remove this text view right here, and I'm going to create a linear layout. And so the linear layout, the width, I'm going to have it be match parent. The height, I'm going to have wrap content. Then I'm going to give the linear layout a padding left because I didn't select the appropriate target API level. So we're going to have to use left and right. I'm going to do a left of 8 dp and a padding, well, how about 20 dp? So 20 dp. And then finally, the last thing I want to do with the linear layout is center in parent. Set that to true. Oh, second to last thing. Let's go ahead and give it a background of CCC. All right, so inside this linear layout, I want to go ahead and have a edit text with a match parent height of wrap content, a hint of username, or how about email, a input type of text email address, and a single line of true. So all of these parameters on this edit text are making it appear with the width, match parent, the height, wrap content. We already know what that means. The hint is the little bit of text that appears inside of there when there isn't any text entered. The input type, I'm setting that to text email address, and what that's going to do is it's going to change the soft keyboard. It's going to, the soft keyboard that comes up when you click on a edit text is going to be different depending on what we set the input type to. And then I'm setting single line to true to make sure that it's not a multi-line text box. So when you hit enter, you don't get a new line of text. Of course, I did forget on this linear layout to set the orientation to vertical. So I'm going to go ahead and do that too. So yeah, I am going a little bit fast with this, but this should be stuff that most of this stuff we've already covered and talked about. Writing layouts is very tedious. Well, it's XML, what do you expect? And so yeah, I might go a little quick with this, and you guys can pause and catch up if you want to. Anyway, let's go ahead and give this edit text a margin bottom of 8 dp. Let's create another edit text with a match parent and a wrap content, a hint of password, This time I'm going to say input type is text password, and then I'm going to say single line is true. Then the last thing I'm going to add to the linear layout is a button. I'm going to say button width of, let's do match parent wrap content. Let's be sure to give our password a margin bottom of ATP. And then let's give our button a text of login. So that's what our login form looks like right now. I think I may have made a mistake right here with this linear layout. I think I actually do want a 20 DP padding around the entirety of the linear layout. So to do that, instead of specifying padding left and padding right individually as 20 DP, I'm going to simply say padding equals 20 DP. And that will increase the padding, and now we have this. Now we have a little bit more room to breathe on our form, and I kind of like that look a little better. Okay, so the next thing I want to go ahead and do is, in this case, I just coded out a login form just to show you guys another example of a really common pattern in building login forms with the Android layout system. So I'm really not going to use the email or password field for anything. I'm just going to use the login button, and that's going to simulate a successful login for this example. So in order to do this, I'm going to give it an ID plus ID slash, and we're going to call this activity login button. And we'll get a lot more practice. If you're still kind of iffy on the view syntax and how to conceptualize building views, we'll get a lot more practice in when we build up that app. I highly recommend, if you are still having some issues with putting views together, particularly getting used to how the autocorrect works and how that can be used to speed up the development of building your layouts, I highly encourage you follow along with this example and kind of type this out, see if you guys can get a little bit more comfortable with writing in this editor. Okay, so anyway, I gave the button an ID, which means I can jump over into my login activity and write its logic. So what I'm going to do here is, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove these two methods that were automatically generated. We don't need these methods. We're not dealing with that. And then the second thing I'm going to do is, instead of extending action bar, I'm going to extend base activity. And the final thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my click handler for my activity login. So after I set the content view for activity login, I'm going to say get view, or sorry, find view by ID, RID login button. And I got to this really quickly just by typing in login capital BU, and you notice that the autocomplete has identified the only choice for that. So get used to the autocomplete, it'll save you a bunch of time. Then I'm going to say find view by ID, login button, then dot set on click listener, new capital ON inner, which gives us the, not only was there an import statement brought in, but we also get the stub for this anonymous inner class. And then what do we want to have happen when we hit the on click, when we click the login button? What do we want to do? Well, basically, we just want to launch the main activity. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to say intent equals new intent. And right here for the context, I'm going to pass in login activity.class. And for the target class, it's going to be main activity.class. Of course, I always get these two mixed up. It should have been login activity.this. Sorry about that. So login activity.this is, of course, the reference to the object that instantiated this anonymous inner class. Anyway, now that we have that, we can go ahead and say start activity, pass an intent. Notice how I don't have to do login activity.this.start activity intent. Now this is valid code, of course, because we reference the parent class or parent object of this anonymous inner class, and then we invoke a public method on it. But of course, we can also do this because every method in the parent type is going to be immediately available to our anonymous inner class. Okay, so that's basically a login activity, and not too exciting. But there's going to be there's one thing we haven't really implemented yet, and that is when we're in our base activity, I want to make sure that no matter what activity is launched, when it gets created, that this activity gets replaced with the login activity after we log in. I also need to write some code in here to keep track of if we are logged in or not. In fact, I'm going to do that first because that'll require us to set that flag in login activity. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up to the top, and I'm going to say public static boolean is logged in, and I'm going to default that to false. So on base activity, we now have this is logged in flag. This isn't the best way to do it. Typically, you would have this information stored in some sort of auth context somewhere that's global. That's some sort of singleton value that you get from your application object. A bunch of stuff we haven't yet talked about. So for now, we're going to use a public static boolean to determine if we've been logged in or not. So coming back into the login activity, before I even create the intent, I'm simply going to say base activity.isLoggedIn equals true. Now you'll find out why this is incredibly important that I set this here in a moment. So in base activity, what I want to have happen is if we're not logged in, I want to go ahead and launch the login activity and just completely forget about what intent launched the application. So there are other ways to handle this, but in this case, this is just a quick, dirty implementation that's fairly robust, with the exception of it will forget the intent that started the application, but that's not going to be a big deal for us. So what I'm going to do here is on the onCreate method, after we call super.onCreate, I'm going to say if not is logged in and and get class does not equal login activity.class, then start activity, new intent, this login activity.class, and then finish, and then return. We could also put a log message in here. We could say log e tag onCreate being replaced with login activity. Okay, so what this is doing is this basically saying if we're not logged in and we're not on the login activity itself, then go ahead and start the login activity and then immediately finish. So basically what this code does is it replaces the current activity with the login activity. It does that by launching the login activity, putting that on top of the stack, and then finishing out the activity that launched the login activity. So people who are paying very close attention might notice a slight issue with the way this is implemented. I want to point out that this is an issue, but we're not going to have to worry about it for our purposes in this video. The issue is the onCreate method of the child class is still going to be invoked. The reason for that is, take for example the main activity. Let's say the user launches this application for the first time. What is a sequence of things that are going to happen? Well, first of all, the main activity is going to be launched. It's going to be created and pushed onto the backstack. That is because the main activity has the intent filter of main and launcher in our Android manifest. Then the first bit of user code that's going to be executed is the main activity's onCreate. For the main activity's onCreate, the first thing he does is he invokes his super onCreate. Going into the super onCreate, we now have the code we just wrote, the code that will, in the case of a first launch, replace the main activity with the login activity. Now, unfortunately, this return is just returning out of the base onCreate, meaning this onCreate is still going to be invoked. Now, it's not going to do much harm, but it will waste cycles and just be unnecessary. It's very unnecessary for us to set the content view and establish a bunch of references to subviews for an activity that just got finished, as you can see with that. Now, there's a couple ways to handle this. The way we're going to be handling this when we build up the app is we're going to have our base activity is going to have an onCreate method, but the child activities, the child classes, are going to have their own onCreate method that they override. That onCreate method will be invoked from the base activity, and that way we'll be able to make it so if they're not logged in, it pushes them to the login activity, but it doesn't invoke the onCreate method if the activity was finished. I think that's the most elegant way to handle this problem. I wanted to point it out for anybody who might have noticed this, and I also wanted to point this out for anybody who didn't notice this. So now that we have this all taken care of, this should be really about it. Now, no matter what activity we launch, we should always get pushed back into the login activity if we haven't previously logged in. So let's go ahead and test that. I'm going to open up my virtual device here. Hit start. Wait for that obnoxious progress bar to go away. So let's go ahead and log in, and let's go ahead and hit that button there. This is taking longer than I expected. I probably should have paused the video. Yeah, every time I do go ahead and pause the video or think I need to pause the video, a second later, whatever I'm waiting on finishes. And then every time I don't pause the video, I have to sit here in awkward silence as Gradle finishes gradling. Okay, here's our running devices. Let's hit OK. And we have, check that out, our login activity. Now what's interesting is we know that our main activity was created. In fact, we can come up here and see onCreate being replaced with login activity for the main activity. Then we have onCreate, onStart, and onResume. You'll notice a slight bug. Our tag hasn't been identified yet. Let's go ahead and fix that first. You see how I say tag equals get class, get simple name, but I did that before, or sorry, after I checked for the is logged in. I'm going to do that as right there, reorder that so that when our log messages appear, it's not a blank tag. Anyway, now that we see the whole thing worked, let me go ahead and show you guys a magic trick here. So an interesting thing that you can do in Android Studio and in Android applications in general is actually specify which activity is going to be launched, which will help us immensely during the development of the application. So what I'm going to do here is just to prove that this works for every single activity, not just the main activity. I'm going to right-click Search Contact Activity, go down to Run, and click that, and we'll get a rebuild because I edited something. And then I'm going to say Use Same Device and hit OK. And now we see the login activity as the first thing, but if I scroll up, notice what activity was created. The Search Contacts activity was created. So that's the activity that was launched. So again, that's a really cool way to really quickly debug activities without having to click through all of them. It's also another reason why activities need to be self-contained. You want to be able to launch self-contained activities so that you can debug things faster. Anyway, then we see our normal stuff, our onCreate, onStart, onResume for our login activity. And of course, when we hit login, we get our main activity, which is what you see right there. Alrighty, so, and also I can continue to press buttons and go into further activities because, of course, our static boolean on our base activity has been set to true. Okay, so this was an interesting look about how we can replace an activity and then launch like something like a login activity or something like that, but it's not actually what I was wanting to show you guys as far as how to deal with the activity lifecycle or change the activity lifecycle. So there's going to be a couple things that we need to handle here. The first is that let's go ahead and launch the app, and I'll show you guys. The first is when I get to my login activity, I hit login, and now I'm logged in. Watch what happens when I hit back. I go all the way back to the login activity. I don't want that. I don't want this login activity to stay on the back stack so that we can access it by hitting the back button. So what I'm going to do here is very simply finish the login activity after we start the main activity. So let's go ahead and jump into our login activity. We already have it open here, but if you don't, open it up. Locate your click handler, and I'm going to add the word finish to the bottom. So after we click on the button, we start the main activity using our intent and the start activity method, and then we finish the login activity. Now what happens when I run So we get our login activity, we log in, we hit a button, select a contact, we hit back, and check that out. We exit the app. So I hit that, then I hit back, and then I hit back, and we exit the app. So the login activity was removed from the backstack. Also notice something interesting. When I click on activities, notice how the activities app, we don't get the login. Why is that? That's because the application is still resident in memory. Because it's still resident in memory, this Boolean is still set to true. So even though I can go ahead and relaunch the app to the main activity, the main launcher activity, I don't get the login screen because that Boolean is still set to true. Okay, so that's one thing that we have to deal with. The next thing I want to deal with also deals with backstack, and it involves the concept of logging out. So let's go ahead and implement logging out. Now the first thing to implement logging out is, of course, going into our activity main, our layout file, and adding a logout button, which should be pretty straightforward to do. I'm going to go ahead and say button, layout width is match parent, wrap content for the height, text is going to be log out, ID is going to be +ID / activity main log out. Ew. Log out. And I made a small mistake. I intended to make this button underneath the activity main button. So go ahead and take this entire XML element, Control-C it, and then Control-V it right there below the activity main button. So now at this point, this logout button is occupying the exact same space as our, or it's not, no, it's not, it's all the way at the top. So to make this occupy the space above the other button, of course, what we have to do is say layout above, which I can access or get to just by typing in lay AB. Like, just typing in lay AB gives me layout above. Again, I don't know how many times I said this, but you guys are probably getting sick of hearing it. Learn to manipulate the autocomplete text box. It'll save you a lot of time. Just typing in lay AB, I can hit enter, and I have the layout above attribute already written in for me. Now I can go ahead and type in main_button, which will give me the main button, hit enter, and now our logout button is located above our other button. And then just to be fancy, I'm going to go down here and say margin bottom is 8 dp. Just give it some space in between the two buttons. Okay, so now that we've done that, we have to go ahead and actually implement the logout behavior. So let's go ahead and jump back into our main activity. And then down here, what I'm going to do is on create, I'm just going to be quick and dirty here. I'm going to say find view by ID, r.id.logout, which gives me activity main logout, .set on click listener, new capital O and enter, and we have our click handler. Now, what is this click handler going to do? Well, you might think you would do something like this. You might think you would do something like base activity dot is logged in equals false, and then start activity new intent main activity this followed by login activity dot class, right? And then finish. Sure. You might think that's what you want to do for this. So the first thing we do is we actually implement the logic for logging out, which in this case is setting our flag to false. Second thing we do is we specify the activity that we want to launch, our login activity, so that we get presented with the form again. And then we hit finish to finish the main activity and remove it from the backstack. So you might think that this will work. Now, it should give us similar behavior to what we're expecting. Let's go ahead and launch it. Because what I'm thinking is, now that I think about it, there's no way to go back to the main activity from another activity without finishing the other activity. So this will work. So let's go ahead and prove it to you. So I'll hit login. I now have the main activity. I can go ahead and launch another activity and then select a contact, and then I log out. And now I'm in login activity. When I hit back, I exit the app, just like you would expect. Now the reason this is working is in the way that it should is very subtle. And unfortunately, in order to give you guys an example of when it wouldn't work would involve creating another activity, and I don't want to drag this example longer or on longer than it needs to. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna explain what's wrong with this. What's wrong with this is if we had a more complicated backstack. If, let's say, the logout button was located on this screen, right? And then we hit the logout button. This screen gets finished, the login screen gets pushed on top. But then what happens if we hit back? So let's say again, we're on the select contact screen, we hit logout. The select contact screen finishes, right? The login activity gets pushed on top. Then we hit back. What will we get? Well, we would get our main activity. Now, in this case, because of our base activity, the main activity will redirect back to the login activity. But we'll get this really weird, unexpected behavior. It's basically what I'm describing as just a very gross sort of thing that would cause a user to become uncomfortable when they hit the back button and they got the login activity again. It's a very subtle bug that we just introduced into our application. So I really want to drive home the point that even if it looks like it works correctly, you have to really visualize the backstack in order to understand why this is not going to work properly. So, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and just really quickly type out what's going on here. Hopefully I'm helping somebody, not just annoying everyone with explaining this over and over again. Here's our backstack, right? And when we launch the application, we have main activity on the top of the backstack, right? Now let's say we enter in another activity. So let's call this a nested activity, and then let's do another one. Let's do another nested activity. So this is our backstack right here. Now what happens if we were in another nested activity? Now normally if we hit back, we would get to nested, and then if we hit back again, we would get into main again, right? Now let's say another nested activity finishes and logs out. So we have log out. What happens now? What does the backstack look like now? Well, it looks like this. And then we have login activity, right? Because another nested activity was replaced by the login activity. Now, when we hit back, what happens? When we hit back, the login activity gets popped off, and we're now in the nested activity. But because nested activity presumably inherits from base activity, and we're no longer logged in, this will then get replaced with login activity. Now let's say we hit back again. Now we launch our main activity, but because main activity extends from base activity, and we're no longer logged in, main activity will get replaced with login activity again. That means if the user really just wants to exit the application by hitting the back button, which is what they should want to do by hitting the back button on the login screen, what will happen is the login screen will appear again, and then one more time, and then the last time they hit back, it'll close the app. Subtle, annoying bug like that. So, really try to visualize the backstack and how it will work when the user presses the back button on their device, and try to match up what a user should expect with what your application actually does. So how do we fix this? Well, we fix this by specifying 2 flags on our intent. And basically what those flags will do is when they're combined, we get what's called a new task. Not only will we get a new task, but we'll clear out the existing task. Now, what is a task? Well, we talked about activities like they're pages on a website, right? Now, you might think, well, a task, intuitively, if you think a task is one level higher than that, you might think the task is the whole website. So like a whole website is a task. You go to a website to accomplish a task. Each page within that website is an activity. That's a decent way to think about it. It is a slightly more complicated because in Android, activities from other applications can insert themselves into a task that was created by your application. Say, for example, your app launches the default built-in camera app to take a picture, and then that camera app then is going to send that data back to your app when it's done. That camera app is going to be inside of your task. So the concept of clearing out a task means that the entire backstack is erased. I mean, that's basically what you have to think about. Just think the entire backstack is erased and we get a new task. And that's what we're going to do. And as a result, we don't even have to worry about finishing this activity when we launch the login activity. Why? Because the entire backstack is going to be cleared anyway, and then it'll be almost as if, or pretty much as if, the user launched the application completely new again. So how do we do this? Well, we do this by adding flags to our intent object. Now you notice that the intent object right now is inline in the argument list to the start activity method. What I want to do is I want to make it not inline so that I can invoke methods on it before passing it into start activity. How do we do this? Well, the fastest way to do this is to Control-Shift-Alt-T and type in variable. So I just type in VAR and hit enter. And then hit enter one more time. Now what that refactoring shortcut did is it took the entirety of what we had before in the argument list, but it aliased it out into a local variable for us, and then replaced the instance of that instantiation with the variable it just created. You could also have done this manually. It's pretty trivial, but again, once you learn the refactoring shortcuts, it becomes much quicker to use them than it would be to type it out yourself. Now that we have access to the intent object before we pass it into start activity, I can invoke methods on it. So if we look, there's a couple of other methods besides our extras. And the important one that we want to worry about right here is the add flags. Now the add flags method adds flags to the intent. Intent flags are just different, they're flags. They're options. They're things saying to Android they're telling Android to behave differently than it normally would. And again, like I said earlier in this video, the documentation has a list of all the different flags you can pass in. But in this case, what our goal is to completely wipe our task clean. Completely wipe our entire backstack. And then launch the login activity as the root of a new backstack or a new task. This will prevent the user from entering back into any of the previous activities that he was messing with in our app by hitting the back button. It'll make Android completely forget about what the user was doing before he hit the logout button, which is the expected behavior of a logout button. So the flags that we need to pass in are going to be intent.flag activity. So you see all the activity flags you have here? Flag activity new task, and then I'm going to go ahead and bitwise OR it with intent.flag activity clear task. So in Java, the single pipe is the bitwise OR. So we're combining the bits from, or the bit from this flag with the bit from this flag, and we're passing it into the add flags method, which will, if you look at the implementation, do what you expect it to. It will bitwise OR assign whatever we passed in. Meaning we could have invoked add flags twice, one with flag activity new task and one with flag activity clear task. But instead I decided to keep that all in one line. Anyway, now that we've done that, now that we hit run, or once we hit run, we will get what seems like the exact same behavior. So we log in, we do some stuff with our activity, we log out, we hit back, and the app closes. Same behavior of what we had before, but you'll notice something different, a little different. Notice how when we log out, we get that new animation. That animation signifies the clearing and the creation of an entirely new task and the complete destruction of the previous backstack. So basically, that animation proves that what we're doing is working, despite the fact we couldn't necessarily test it because I didn't create a proper scenario to show you guys in which case it wouldn't have worked when we didn't do this the other way. That was a terribly convoluted sentence, and if you didn't pick up any of it, don't worry, it's not important. Anyway, so now that we have that put together, that's really the first big thing I want to show you guys. I want to show you guys the ability to manipulate the way in which an activity is launched via an intent. And we also saw an interesting pattern of how to deal with login screens in the process that we will be repeating when we build the app, but it'll of course, when we build the app, it'll be slightly more robust, because that I consider to be production code, whereas this I consider to be kind of throwaway show examples sort of code. Now the last thing I want to show you guys is the concept of a home screen, the concept of a main screen. So in this application, my main activity is considered to be my main screen, my Twitter timeline, my Facebook timeline, my the main entry point of which my inbox sort of thing, right? That's what I consider my main activity to be. So there are going to be certain circumstances where I may need to have a way to get back into my main activity. So, for example, what I'm saying is, let's say I'm deeply nested inside of my application. So my backstack looks very big. At the root of my backstack, of course, is my main activity. But I want to go ahead and clear out all the stuff, all the activities that were in front of it, and go down all the way back down into that main activity. Now, there's a couple ways to do this. So, I don't know if I'm being very clear. I'll show you guys an example. What I'm going to do here is inside of my activity select or search contact, which is very high in the hierarchy, I'm going to add another button. So under the cancel button, I'm going to go ahead and say button. Layout width is going to be match parent, wrap content for the height. Text is going to be go back to main activity. ID is going to be +ID / activity search contacts go back. So for this button right here that I just implemented in my layout, what I want to have happen is I want to go back into the main activity, regardless of what activities are in front of or sorry, in back of this activity, regardless of what the backstack looks like. So let's go ahead and see what would happen if we implemented this just off the top of our heads, naively, not thinking about exactly what it is we're telling Android to do. So I'm going to jump into our search contacts activity, and then I'm going to say find view by ID, RID, go back, which I just had to type in go back, dot set on click listener, capital ON inner. Oh, that didn't work. New capital ON inner. Derp. And then I'm going to say, let's go ahead and say start activity, new intent, search contacts activity dot this, followed by main activity dot class, and then we can also go ahead and just finish. Okay, let's go ahead and hit run. Now, behavior that we're going to get is, now you guys, if you're paying close attention, you should understand why we get the behavior that we're about to get. It shouldn't come as a surprise. So when I go ahead and hit login, then I'm going to hit a button, then I'm going to hit search for contact. Now I'm going to say go back to main activity. Now what actually just happened? What happened is main activity was just created. A new main activity was created, and it was pushed on top of the backstack. Now it's not the behavior that we're looking for. Why is that? Why? Because when I hit back, look what happens. We go back to our select contact, and then hit back again, and we go back to another main activity. So you see how when I launched the activity naively, all I really did was I replaced the top of the backstack with a new instantiation of the activity main, but yet keeping the old instantiation of main activity all the way at the top of the backstack. So this isn't, or the bottom, sorry. This isn't the behavior we want. What we want to have happen is whenever we launch the main activity, I want the entire application to unwind to the root of the backstack, leave everything behind, and pretend that we just undid the entire backstack and we're back at the main activity. And if we were to ever hit back from the main activity, then we would basically exit the application. So what I want to go ahead and do is I want to go ahead and implement that. And I can do that by changing what's called the launch mode. So coming back into the Android manifest, well, there are different parameters we can pass into our activity elements. So you see we have an activity element for every single activity that we have. If we don't have an activity element for an activity, we can't launch it. It has to be listed here. But there's more things we can pass in than just the name and the label of the activity. We can also modify what's called the launch mode. Now, the launch mode is the second way in which we can manipulate how Android deals with activity lifecycle. The first one was adding flags to an intent, and that happens at the intent level. But there's also ways we can modify things at the activity level. So let's go ahead and do that. On the main activity, I'm going to add a new attribute, and it's going to be called launch mode. And you'll see we have 4 instances. We have single instance, single task, single top, and standard. In this case, the one that I want to, the default obviously is going to be standard, so this is basically a no-op. So that's not very interesting. But the more interesting ones are going to be the single instance, single task, and single top. Okay, let's just go top to bottom. Single instance, what does this do? Single instance means this activity is going to be the only activity in the entire task at all. What does that mean? Well, that means any activity launched from this activity is going to be placed in a new task. So a single instance is not particularly interesting. In fact, I can't think of any circumstance other than a launcher application that would use a single instance activity. So again, it basically just means that this activity is the only activity of a task, and any additional activities launched from this activity will get pushed onto a new task. What's interesting about that is you can accomplish the exact same thing using intent flags. So I find single instance to be kind of annoyingly useless. Single task is actually going to be the one we want to use for this instance. Now, what single task does is it prevents multiple instances of this activity from being in the same task at the same time. So if I were to set this a single task, what happens is main activity becomes kind of, you think of it as the root, or a task that can, or an activity that can never be instantiated more than once. So that means that if you try to launch this activity when it already exists, what's going to happen is the backstack will be unwinded to the point of this activity, basically unwinding all the way back down to the root of the application. Okay, single top. Now, single top is interesting. Basically, single top means that if this activity tries to launch itself, then the activity won't be recreated. So let's say you have an activity, and let's say that activity can launch itself. Under normal circumstances, you would just get another instance of that activity pushed onto the backstack. So you had if instance A, instance B, instance C, instance D, right? You would have 4 elements on your backstack if you had this activity launch itself 4 times. But if it was set to single top, that wouldn't happen. So single top, this activity can still be instantiated and displayed from other activities, but when it tries to instantiate display itself, it doesn't get recreated. Instead, a special method called onNewIntent is invoked. So that's single top. In this case, single task is the one that we want to deal with. So if we go ahead and hit run now, watch what happens to our, oh, that's not our device, our main activity. So let's log in. Let's hit a button, search for contact. Now let's say go back to main activity. Now we're back to the main activity, but watch what happens when I hit back. The application closes. Opening activities again, we have a button. Again, I can hit go back to main activity and now hit back. That, by virtue of the fact that the app closed when I hit back, that implies what happened was the entire backstack was unwound all the way to the root of the application. In this case, the root of the application being main activity. Anyway, so in this video, we showed you guys how to deal with 2 ways to manipulate the life cycle of your activities. You have your launch mode on your activity itself, and you also have your, let's see, where did I put that? That was in main activity. You also have intent flags that you can add to individual intents. So that's really what I wanted to introduce here. I just wanted to show you guys that, as well as a couple of other fun stuff. We'll be expanding on a lot more of this in future videos. So that really about does it for the introduction to activity lifecycle. I've showed you guys a lot of stuff. I've been talking for a long time. We haven't really built anything yet. But the reason is I really want to get at least a brief overview of the theoretical side of activities before we start actually going in and implementing them. As you work with Android, you'll start to gain an intuition of how to deal with them, and you'll find out they're really not that complicated or difficult to work with. You just have to know the right callbacks, to do the right thing with the right intent flags, to make the right backstack, and to make your users happy, and to get $1 billion off the App Store. So that's really all I wanted to do in this video, and we'll see you guys in the next one.